The wind that day carried a chill, the kind that cut straight through thin clothing and gnawed at an empty stomach. The small boy moved from person to person, his steps unsteady, his voice little more than a whisper as he asked for scraps. His hands were cracked from cold and dirt, his ribs sharp against his skin, yet his eyes held that flicker of hope only children can carry. Most people turned away. Some muttered under their breath, others shooed him off as though he were no more than a stray animal. Still, hunger pushed him forward. He didn't want much, just a piece of bread, a small kindness to quiet the pain inside his belly. But that world was not kind. A group of men noticed him lingering too long near the stalls. Instead of seeing a child desperate to survive, they saw an annoyance, a nuisance. Their voices rose, sharp and accusing, calling him a thief, though he had stolen nothing. The boy tried to explain, his words stumbling out, but his voice trembled too softly to matter. One rough hand gripped his arm, another shoved him hard to the ground, and suddenly the crowd seemed to close in around him. His pleas dissolved into the noise. What came next was a punishment he did not deserve, a cruelty born from power meeting weakness. Onlookers pretended not to see. Some walked faster, others lowered their gaze, afraid or unwilling to interfere. A few even nodded along as though justice were being carried out. The boy's small frame curled up against the strikes, his thin shoulders shaking. Every sound, every blow pressed the weight of despair deeper into his chest. And yet, through the haze of fear, he still wished for someone, anyone, to step forward, to say that this was wrong. That wish was answered in a way none of them expected. From the far edge of the gathering, a shadow began to grow. A figure unlike the rest moved closer, each step heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore. He was tall, so tall that even the tallest men seemed small beside him. Broad shoulders filled, with quiet strength, eyes dark and steady, like a storm rolling over the plains. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they turned to see him. Some recognized him instantly, others only knew the stories of a Lakota giant, a protector of the weak, a man who carried the weight of his people's pride in his very stance. The boy, half conscious with fear, felt the sudden shift in the air. The hands that had struck him faltered, though they did not let go. The crowd fell into silence, broken only by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The giant's gaze swept over the scene, resting on the trembling child. Something unspoken passed through his eyes, something that made the strongest men stiffen as though they were the ones on trial. The leader of the group tried to speak, his voice uncertain as he muttered excuses about order and discipline. But the words hung weakly in the cold air. The Lakota giant did not look at him. Instead, he stepped closer to the boy, his presence alone forcing the circle of men to back away without realizing it. He crouched slightly, his massive frame folding down to meet the boy's frightened eyes. And then, in a voice that rumbled low and steady, he said the words that froze every soul present. "He is my son." The world seemed to stop. The men who had raised their hands now stared in disbelief, caught between fear and shame. The boy blinked, uncertain if he had heard correctly, uncertain if he was still dreaming inside the fog of pain. The giant's hand reached out, not to strike, but to shield, his shadow covering the child completely. What would happen next? No one knew. But in that single moment, the balance of power had shifted, and the story was only just beginning. The silence stretched after those words, heavy and unshakable, as if the world itself paused to listen. The men who had surrounded the child glanced at one another, their hands still hovering awkwardly, unsure if they should defend their actions or retreat. None dared to speak too loudly. They had heard rumors about the Lakota giant before, rumors of his strength, of how he had once stopped a charging bull barehanded, of how his voice alone could quiet a room. But here he stood, not as a legend, not as a whisper carried by campfires, but as a living force. His calm tone carried more weight than any shout ever could. The boy lay curled at his feet, his breath ragged, his thin arms still shielding his face. Slowly, he peeked upward, uncertain if this towering figure was truly there for him. The man's eyes softened when they met the boy's, though his jaw remained tight, his shoulders hard as stone. To those who watched, it was clear that something bound the two together now, something that could not easily be broken by the sneers of a few cruel men. Yet the crowd did not disperse. Whispers floated through the cold air. Some muttered that the child was a beggar, a burden, a mouth too small to feed itself, yet daring enough to ask for food. Others argued in hushed tones that the giant had no right to claim him, that a stranger's word could not erase what had already happened. Suspicion clung to the scene like smoke, and though fear held their hands at their sides, their eyes were restless, darting between the boy and the giant, as though searching for a reason to interfere. The leader of the group, a man with a narrow face and restless eyes, finally cleared his throat. His voice cracked, but he forced it louder, trying to reclaim the authority he had lost. "This boy has no father," he said. "He's been running through the market for days, taking what he pleases, pestering honest folk. We only meant to teach him a lesson." The Lakota giant did not flinch. He did not argue or raise his voice. Instead, he shifted his stance, broad shoulders rolling back, his full height towering over them all. The effect was immediate. Men who moments before had seemed eager to punish a starving child now avoided his gaze. "You call this teaching?" he asked, his tone even, his words slow, as if measuring the weight of each syllable. No one dared to answer. The boy's chest tightened as he listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone spoke for him. His life until now had been one of shadows, where his voice was too small to be heard and his hunger too constant to be pitied. He had forgotten what it felt like to be defended, to have someone stand between him and the cruelty of others. And yet, he still could not understand why this man, a stranger, would claim him as a son. The giant placed one massive hand gently on the boy's shoulder. The touch was steady, grounding, and it carried with it an unspoken promise. "Stand," he said softly. The boy hesitated but obeyed, his legs trembling beneath him. His body was thin, almost frail, but the giant's hand kept him steady. The crowd watched with wide eyes, their fear deepening, for now they could see the difference in size, in strength, in presence. Against the man before them, none would dare raise a hand again. But questions grew in their minds. Who was this giant to speak so boldly? Why claim a boy no one else wanted? Some whispered that he was a warrior of old, a man who had walked with chiefs and stood in battles that shaped the land. Others wondered if he was a spirit, a figure sent by ancestors to shield the forgotten. Yet beneath the awe, jealousy lingered. There were those who resented his strength, who saw his presence as a challenge to their own authority. The boy sensed the tension, even if he did not understand all the reasons for it. He clung to the thought that maybe, just maybe, he had been chosen for something beyond misery. Still, fear gnawed at him. What if the giant's claim was only words? What if tomorrow the man disappeared and he was once again alone? The uncertainty weighed on him, but he stayed close, because for now, the giant was the only thing standing between him and a world that had shown no mercy. The leader of the group tried again, his pride wounded. "You can't simply take him. He belongs nowhere. He eats from scraps. He has no family." His voice grew sharper as he searched for courage. "If you protect him, you take in his hunger too. Do you think you can carry that burden?" The Lakota giant's gaze shifted, his eyes dark and unyielding. "Hunger is not a crime," he said, "but cruelty is." The words struck like stones, and for the first time, shame flickered across the faces of those who had raised their hands against the child. Still, pride is a stubborn thing. The leader clenched his fists, though he did not step forward. He knew the strength before him was not something he could match. The boy, though silent, was listening to every word. His heart beat faster, a mixture of fear and hope twisting inside him. He wondered if he had truly found a protector, someone who saw worth where others saw only weakness. The giant's hand remained firm on his shoulder, and though the world around them bristled with suspicion, he felt safer than he had in years. The crowd began to thin as whispers grew louder, carrying the story of what had happened. Some left quickly, eager to distance themselves from the shame of the scene. Others lingered, curious, waiting to see what would unfold. Rumors spread swiftly in places like this, and by nightfall, the tale of the starving child and the Lakota giant would travel far beyond the market. But for now, the air still crackled with unspoken tension. The leader's eyes burned with resentment. The boy's heart wavered between trust and doubt, and the giant stood unmoving, his presence a wall no one dared to cross. The boy did not yet know why the giant had chosen him, or what dangers lay ahead because of that choice. All he knew was that the world had changed in an instant, and with it came a mystery that would not be easily answered. The giant turned slightly, guiding the boy away from the crowd. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the path before them was already filling with unseen trials. Behind them, the men muttered under their breath, their anger simmering though they dared not act. Around them, the market returned to motion, but it moved with unease, every glance carrying questions no one spoke aloud. And as the boy walked beneath the shadow of the giant, his mind churned with questions of his own. Who was this man? Why had he called him son? What did it mean for his future? The answers lay ahead, hidden in a story only beginning to unfold, a story that carried both danger and hope in equal measure. The crowd may have faded, the blows may have stopped, but the real conflict had only just been born. The boy walked beside the Lakota giant, his small steps nearly swallowed by the stride of the man who now shielded him. The market behind them buzzed faintly, but its noise seemed far away, like echoes in a dream. The boy glanced up often, still half afraid the giant would vanish like a vision. Yet each time, he saw the same steady figure, shoulders like a fortress, gaze fixed ahead. The world felt different in his shadow, and though the boy's stomach ached with hunger for the first time in days, the fear inside him eased. But not everyone had been silenced. The narrow-faced man who had led the punishment lingered in the crowd, his pride burning hotter than the shame he carried. He watched the giant walk away with the boy, his jaw clenched, his mind already weaving words to turn others against this stranger. Strength might win a moment, but whispers and suspicion could rot foundations over time. In his eyes, the boy was worthless, and the giant's protection was a threat to the order he clung to. Quietly, he vowed this story would not end here. Tut-tau. Boy, unaware of the schemes forming behind him, struggled to keep pace. His legs trembled, both from weakness and the weight of new questions. Why had the giant claimed him as a son? Was it out of pity? Or was there a reason deeper than the boy could understand? He had no memory of family, only scattered images of faces long gone. To hear someone call him son struck him like lightning, strange, frightening, but also warm. He did not know if he could believe it, yet he wanted to. The giant seemed to sense his doubts. After a long silence, he spoke without looking down. "You have wandered alone too long," he said. "That ends now." His tone was not soft, but it carried certainty, a promise the boy could not ignore. Still, the child lowered his eyes, afraid to hope too much. Life had taught him that kindness was often fleeting, that people's hearts shifted like the wind. And yet something about this man's presence felt unshakable, as though even the earth itself would move before he did. As the two made their way through the settlement, eyes followed them. Some stared with quiet awe, whispering of the Lakota, giant who had returned after so many seasons. Others frowned with suspicion, worried that his strength and his claim over the boy would stir unrest. Every community carried its fractures, its jealousies, and the sight of someone stepping so boldly into a role not asked of him fanned hidden embers into sparks. Among those watching was an elder woman who sold herbs by the path. Her eyes, lined with years of hardship, softened as she saw the child walking beneath the giant's arm. She had seen too many orphans, too many little ones swept aside by hunger and cruelty. She muttered a prayer under her breath, though she knew the path ahead would not be simple. If the giant meant to shield the boy, he would face storms not only from outsiders, but from within their own people. That night, the boy found himself in a small shelter at the edge of the village. The fire crackled low, and the smell of broth filled the air. It had been so long since he had eaten something warm that he could barely hold back tears as he tasted it. The giant sat nearby, silent as always, his presence filling the room. The boy wanted to ask why, wanted to know what. It meant to be called son, but fear of losing what little he had kept him quiet. He chose instead to hold onto the warmth of the fire and the comfort of not being alone. While the boy drifted toward sleep, whispers grew louder in the heart of the settlement. Men gathered in the shadows, their voices hushed, but their anger clear. Some argued the giant had humiliated them before the market, stripping them of power in front of their own people. Others feared that if he could claim a starving child so boldly, what else might he take? Jealousy crept through their words, and the narrow-faced man fanned it with careful lies. He spoke of danger, of how the giant's strength might turn against them, of how the boy would drain resources already scarce. One by one, doubt took root. At the same time, another story began to spread. Among the women and children, whispers carried a different tune, one of hope. They spoke of the giant's stand, of how he had shielded a child no one else dared to protect. Some remembered their own hunger, their own losses, and in the boy's trembling frame they saw themselves. They wondered if his rescue was more than chance. If perhaps it was a sign of change, a reminder that compassion had not yet died among them. The boy sensed none of this as he slept, but the currents of conflict gathered around him like storm clouds. His life, once unnoticed, now sat at the center of a struggle he could not yet name. The giant, however, knew it well. He had walked long roads, seen how quickly men could turn on one another when fear whispered in their ears. His choice to claim? The boy was not one of chance. It was a stand, one he would not abandon, no matter what challenges rose from it. Yet even he could not know how deep the shadows reached. The narrow-faced man had not only stirred resentment among his peers, but also reached for allies beyond the settlement, men whose loyalty could be bought with promises of power. Plans were forming in quiet corners, plans that would test not only the strength of the Lakota giant, but the spirit of the child who had been given a name he had never known before. Son. The days that followed were uneasy. The boy tried to settle into this new life, yet every kindness felt fragile. He learned small tasks, helped with simple chores, and listened to the giant's few but steady words. But each time he stepped outside, he felt the eyes of others. Some looked at him with sympathy, some with curiosity, and some with resentment so sharp it made his chest tighten. He began to wonder if he had brought trouble upon the man who had chosen to protect him. The giant noticed his worry and placed a hand on his shoulder one evening. "You are not trouble," he said firmly. "You are a life. That is worth more than all their fear." The boy nodded, though doubt still lingered in his heart. He wanted to believe it, but the weight of stares and whispers pressed hard against his small frame. Far away from their small fire, The narrow-faced man sat with his allies, weaving plans like a spider spinning a web. "He made us weak before our own people," he hissed. "If we allow him to grow roots here, none of us will have a voice left. He has claimed the boy, but he means to claim more. We must strike before he does." His words struck chords of pride and fear, and slowly, heads nodded in agreement. The boy, unaware of the storm being built around him, lay awake that night. He watched the giant rest in silence, his chest rising and falling steadily. For the first time he wondered not just who this man was, but what his own life meant now that he was not alone. The world had always told him he was nothing, but in the giant's voice he had been called son. That word burned in his heart, fragile but powerful, and it frightened him as much as it gave him hope. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the first signs of change. The conflict that had begun with whispers in a marketplace was growing, spreading into every corner of their lives. Neither the boy nor the giant could see how far it would reach, but the path they had stepped onto was one that could not be undone. And in the silence of the night, tension thickened like smoke, waiting for the spark that would turn it into fire. The days grew colder, and the settlement seemed to carry an edge sharper than the wind. Wherever the boy went, he could feel the silence pressing against him, eyes watching from shadows, whispers following behind. Some of the children looked at him with curiosity, even kindness, but many of the adults carried doubt. He could sense it in the way they tightened their lips, the way they shifted when the Lakota giant passed by. It was as if his very presence stirred something in them, fear, resentment, envy, and though none spoke aloud against him in daylight, the tension was thick enough to taste. The giant remained steady, his face calm, but the boy noticed how often he scanned the paths, how his hand lingered near the knife at his side when strangers came too close. He was not a man easily shaken, but he was a man who listened to silence as though it spoke louder than words. He knew the storm was building, even if no one dared admit it. The boy, though still small and uncertain, could feel it too. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground trembling beneath your feet, knowing something was coming but not knowing when. One evening, as the fire burned low, the boy finally asked the question that had been clawing at his heart. "Why did you call me son?" His voice was thin, almost afraid of the answer. The giant looked at him for a long time, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he said, "Because no one else would. And because I see in you what others are blind." "Tuh," he said no more, but the boy felt the words sink into him, heavy yet steadying. It was not a promise of an easy path, but it was enough to keep his hope alive. But hope alone could not quiet the anger building among the men who had once held power. The narrow-faced man grew restless, his bitterness twisting deeper with each passing day. He gathered others at night, men who shared his jealousy, men who feared the influence the giant carried simply by standing tall. They spoke of lost control, of pride wounded before the market, of the danger in letting one man's word outweigh the rest. Their voices grew bolder in the dark, and slowly, a plan began to take shape. The boy did not know the details, but he felt the weight of danger growing heavier. He noticed how food seemed scarcer when he appeared at the stalls, how people turned away quicker than before. He overheard murmurs about curses, about outsiders, about how no man should step above the rest. Each word burrowed into his chest, feeding his old fear that he did not belong, that he was a burden even to the one who called him son. One night, unable to sleep, the boy slipped outside and wandered to the edge of the settlement. The moon hung pale above him, the air sharp in his lungs. He stood there, staring at the fields beyond, and wondered if leaving would protect the giant from the trouble he had brought. He had lived alone before. He knew the pain of hunger, the cold of sleeping in shadows. But now, it felt different. Leaving would not just mean hunger. It would mean tearing away the one thread of belonging he had ever touched. His chest ached at the thought, and he sank to his knees, torn between fear and longing. The giant found him there, sitting in the frost. He said nothing at first, only stood behind him like a mountain in the night. Then his deep voice broke the silence. "If you run, they will say they were right. If you stay, you show them what they cannot destroy." The boy turned, his eyes wide, unsure if he had the strength for such a task. The giant crouched low, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. "You are stronger than you believe. The world will test you. Let it." Even as those words settled into him, the storm broke closer. By the next day, the tension that had lurked in corners began to surface in daylight. A group of men approached. While the boy was helping carry water, their words sharp, accusing. They claimed he was stealing again, that he was eating food meant for others. The boy shook his head, his voice breaking as he tried to deny it, but they ignored him. The giant appeared before they could press further, his shadow falling over them like thunderclouds. The men stepped back, but their eyes gleamed with challenge, and the boy knew they would not stop here. Rumors thickened, twisting into lies. Some said the boy brought misfortune. Others whispered that the giant meant to take control of the whole settlement by claiming a son no one else wanted. Division grew, and with it, a dangerous silence, the kind that comes before a spark catches fire. The boy could feel it each time he stepped outside. The way people looked past him, the way the men tightened their fists, the way the giant's eyes narrowed as if expecting danger around every corner. And danger was indeed coming. The narrow-faced man had set his plan, whispering promises of power to those who felt overlooked. He spoke of striking quickly, of proving that strength was not enough to lead. He spoke of teaching both the boy and the giant a lesson they would not forget. His voice carried venom, and his followers drank it eagerly. The boy, sensing the change, but not knowing the full threat, stayed close to the giant. Yet his heart pounded with unease. Every sound seemed louder, every glance heavier. He wondered if he was the cause of the coming storm, if the world would have been steadier without him. Still, the giant's steady hand on his shoulder reminded him that he was not alone, even as the shadows grew darker. Then came the night when everything shifted. The fire burned low inside the shelter, and the boy stirred from uneasy dreams. Outside, he heard footsteps. Too many for this hour, too heavy to be chance. His breath caught in his throat, and he looked toward the giant, who was already awake, his eyes sharp, his body still but ready. The boy's pulse hammered in his ears as the footsteps grew closer, circling, surrounding. The giant rose slowly, his height filling the space, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, though he had not yet drawn it. The boy clutched his blanket, his small frame trembling, his eyes darting toward the door. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though holding its breath. Outside, voices hissed low, commands muttered. The scrape of weapons carried through the night. The boy knew, without being told, that this was not a visit, not a warning. This was the storm, and he and the giant stood at its center. The door rattled, the fire crackled, and the boy's chest tightened with fear and anticipation. Whatever was about to unfold would change everything. The night had come alive with threat, and the moment before the first strike felt longer than eternity. The boy looked up at the giant, whose face was calm but fierce, his presence unshaken. The boy did not know how this would end, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would not run. And as the shadows outside drew closer, the tension reached its breaking point, holding the world on the edge of what was about to begin. The door shuddered as rough hands pressed against it, shadows shifting just beyond the thin walls of the shelter. The boy's breath quickened, his heart pounding so loud he thought the men outside might hear it. The fire burned low, its glow flickering across the giant's steady face. He stood tall, unmoving, his body a shield between the boy and the danger, gathering outside. The first blow came hard against the wood. A voice barked, sharp and venomous, calling out that the boy must be given up, that the giant had no right to protect him. The boy shrank back, his hands gripping his blanket tight, but the giant stepped forward, his voice deep and calm, cutting through the chaos. "He is my son. You will not take him." The men outside jeered, their anger rising. Another strike came, splintering part of the frame. The boy thought the walls might give way, that the shadows would pour in and swallow them both. But then the giant reached for the latch, and with deliberate calm, he pulled the door wide open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the bitter smell of fear and rage. There they stood, men armed with clubs and blades, their faces twisted with resentment. At their front was the narrow-faced man, eyes glittering with triumph, as though this moment would finally erase his humiliation. But when the door opened, when the giant stood framed in the fire's glow, a hush fell for just a breath. His height, his calm, his unshaken stance unsettled even the boldest of them. The boy clung to the edge of the doorway, watching as the two sides faced one another. The giant's voice rumbled low, steady as thunder rolling across the plains. "You speak of teaching lessons, yet what do you show the children when you strike the hungry? You speak of order, yet your hearts are filled with jealousy. You call this strength, but it is nothing more than fear." The narrow-faced man spat, his voice sharp and bitter. "You shame us before our own people. You think yourself above us, but you are only one man. Tonight, you will learn that even giants can fall." He raised his weapon, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold still. The boy thought the clash would come, that violence would spill into the night. But before the first step could be taken, voices rose from the darkness. Different voices, softer at first, then stronger. Women had come from the shadows, children clutched to their skirts, elders leaning on their canes. They had followed the whispers, had seen the danger building, and now they stood together, forming a wall of humanity behind the giant. An elder woman spoke first, her voice carrying across the cold air. "We saw what happened that day. We saw the boy beaten when he only asked for bread, and we saw who stood for him when no one else would. Do not call that shame, call it courage." Murmurs spread through the gathering, uncertain at first, then firmer. One by one, others spoke, men and women alike, saying they were tired of cruelty, tired of seeing children treated as burdens. The boy's eyes widened as he realized they were speaking for him, not against him. His heart swelled, a fragile hope breaking through his fear. The narrow-faced man's confidence faltered as the crowd shifted. His allies glanced around uneasily, their grip on their weapons loosening. What had begun as a show of strength now looked like weakness in the face of unity. Still, pride burned hot in his chest, and he shouted once more, "He is nothing! Beggar, a thief, a curse upon us all!" The giant stepped forward, his shadow falling across the narrow-faced man. His voice was quiet, but it carried farther than any shout. "He is my son, and tonight, every child who hungers, every voice ignored, knows they are not alone. If you see a curse, it is only in your own heart." The words struck deeper than any blade. The narrow-faced man's fury collapsed into silence as the people turned their eyes on him, not with fear, but with disappointment. He tried to speak again, but no one listened. Slowly, his allies drifted back into the crowd, leaving him alone in his bitterness. The night ended not in blood, but in choice. The men lowered their weapons, the crowd broke apart, and the cold air carried with it the weight of something shifting. For the first time in years, kindness had stood taller than cruelty, and the people had chosen to see it. The boy, still trembling, stepped outside and stood beneath the giant's shadow. He looked around at the faces, some smiling faintly, some thoughtful, some ashamed, and he felt something new stir inside him, belonging. Not because he had been born into it, not because the world had given it freely, but because someone had claimed him, had seen him as worth protecting. The giant placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and grounding. "Walk with me," he said. And so the boy walked, his small frame beside the towering man, through a settlement that no longer seemed as cold. Whispers still followed them, but now they were different. Curious, thoughtful, even hopeful. In the days that followed, change spread slowly, but it spread. The boy no longer wandered alone. He had work, he had meals, and though not everyone welcomed him, enough did. The giant's presence remained steady, but he did not need to raise his voice again. The stand he had made that night echoed longer than any battle could. The narrow-faced man faded into the background, his pride broken, his voice no longer carrying weight. He lingered at the edges, but his power had slipped away. The people had seen him exposed, and no amount of shouting could restore what had been lost. The boy, though still young, carried the memory of that night deep in his heart. He remembered the fear, the shadows, the voices calling him worthless. But stronger than all of that, he remembered the moment the giant stood tall and said, "He is my son." Those words became his anchor, his proof that even the smallest, most forgotten life could be seen, could be valued. And as he grew, he carried that lesson with him. Whenever he saw another child turned away, whenever he heard another voice silenced, he remembered what it felt like to be pulled from the ground and shielded by someone stronger. He knew then that his story was not just his own. It was a reminder, to himself, to his people, to anyone who listened, that compassion was strength, and that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it simply stood, unshaken, against the tide. Years later, people still told the story of the starving boy and the Lakota giant. They told it by fires, in whispers, in laughter, and in tears. Some told it as a tale of courage, some as a lesson in pride, but all remembered it. And the boy, no longer a boy, carried it not as a burden, but as a gift. A reminder of the night the world had called him nothing, and a single voice had answered, "You are my son." And that, more than anything, was what changed everything.